America has tried to get rid of Cuba unsuccessfully for a very, very long time. But the reason why we're talking about it now, Anushka, is that Cuba is on its own the way that it has never been on its own. And if there's any chance to bring this government down, this is the moment. And I think that's the calculation in the White House.
Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld. I'm Anushka Asthana in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Matt Frei in London. Today we're going to discuss the crisis in Cuba. No food, no fuel, no tourists. Donald Trump has his foot on Cuba's neck.
And Matt, I think it is fair to say that you are a little obsessed with Cuba, aren't you? Why?
I am indeed. I think I'm not going to hide it. That's because when I lived in the United States between 2002 and 2013, I went to Cuba quite a lot and always for work, but we always managed to add on a little bit of pleasure. But the point is that I saw that Cuba, probably at its best, apart from the kind of heyday of the Cold War when it was fully funded by the Soviet Union, and it really mattered in terms of geopolitics, the famous Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But when I was there, the country was beginning to open up a little bit. And you had these extraordinary restaurants that suddenly popped up in people's, literally in their houses. You want to have a meal? Go upstairs, take the second door on the right, past the bathroom, don't mind Granny sitting in the television room. And there was then this pop-up restaurant and you could have a decent meal. And you sort of saw micro-capitalism in Cuba flex its wings a little bit. And of course, Cuba has been through various ructions of opening up and closing down, of America acting as a predator or not, over the decades, really. And at that particular moment, it was the end of the Bush era, Bush Jr., who was, not particularly open towards Cuba, but wasn't shutting things down either. And then Obama came in, and Obama really tried to kill the Cuban regime with kindness, thinking that if you open up Cuba to tourism, you allow lots of Americans to go there, you allow some Cubans to come to America, then they will suddenly realize on the island of Cuba, oh my God, there's a thing called the internet, or you can order really good food online, and there's another life out there that we have not yet experienced in Cuba, and they would then put pressure on the regime, and then eventually the regime would be killed with kindness. Well, that didn't really happen, and of course, after Obama left office, Trump came in, and Trump was tough on Cuba. He ended the direct flights, the openness of tourism, et cetera, and then Cuba found itself in a dark phase. But the reason why we're talking about it now, Anushka, is that it is in the darkest phase it's arguably ever been in its 65 years since the Fidel Castro revolution. And that's because just in the last 6 weeks, Cuba has lost its biggest ally and supporter and friend and provider of much of its oil. And that is, of course, Venezuela. So Venezuela is no longer sending Cuba, from that short distance of Venezuela to the island of Cuba. Mexico has also stopped its imports of oil to Cuba. And therefore, you have a fuel crisis in Cuba where they only produce 40% of the oil that they need domestically. That means that, banks can't open, ATM machines don't work if you have any money in them at all. Restaurants are shutting down. Hospitals have had to pool their resources. There are power outages in some parts of the island of almost 24 hours a day. Tourism, which was the main income, especially of foreign currency for Cuba, has effectively stopped because hotels are having to shut down. Flights that flew from Canada, which is a big source of tourism, or from Russia, or from China for that matter, can't refuel when they get to Havana. Therefore, there are no long-haul flights anymore. So the whole place is shut down. And the question, I wonder what you're hearing on the ground in Washington, is to what extent is this, regime change by slow bleed, Trump with his foot very much on Cuba's neck after Venezuela?
I think January the 3rd, when they took the action that they took in Venezuela, it was right then, at that time, with Cuba in mind. I think Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, said almost on day one that if I was a minister in Cuba right now, I'd been worried. And when we were trying to understand how it affects Cuba, the kind of aim of it appeared to be, what you're describing that has unfolded, that this idea of blocking the oil would slowly cause a humanitarian crisis in Cuba that would in turn result in a change in regime. It feels like a pretty horrific way to try to bring around what you're talking about when, as you said, the situation right now is really dire. There is rubbish building up on the streets. As you say, the planes aren't going. The entire power grid is teetering right now. And actually, we've heard from the UN on all of this. And what they describe is pretty awful. Have a listen to what the UN Marta Hurtado has said about Cuba.
In Cuba, there's food baskets, a system of rations. These rations have been already cut, but it does not fuel to put in the trucks to be able to distribute food. People might not get food, might not be able to eat. So there's no drinkable water, there's no food, there's no medicines. So the whole system of protecting the population, protecting their rights to food, to health, to water, it's dismantled.
I mean, I've been to Cuba in the past when the shelves have been, very thinly stocked, but now we've got empty shelves. And, the most basic supplies of food, let alone power, which you discussed earlier, have just gone. And it is really hard to see how this regime can survive for much longer without doing a deal with America. And we'll talk to Jon Lee Anderson, the veteran New Yorker correspondent who really knows Cuba very well indeed, has got great contacts with the Cuban leadership, what kind of deal they are prepared to engage in that doesn't involve, political suicide for them. And that's a big question. But I think it's also important for us, Anushka, to dwell on the importance of Marco Rubio in all this, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor. Little Marco, as Trump used to call him disparagingly, has had his big moment with Cuba, partly because of his heritage. His parents came over from Cuba before the revolution of 1959. And then he set up with his family in southern Florida, which is really kind of, obviously you have Little Havana in Miami, but it feels very Cuban. There are hundreds of thousands of Cubans, exiled Cubans in southern Florida. They have an enormous importance on Florida politics. Florida used to be a key swing state, so all this matters. And Marco Rubio thinks in the second Trump administration that, and Trump tried stuff with Cuba in the first administration, but he wasn't really focused. In the second Trump administration, because he is Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, and obviously at the moment in Trump's good books, he thinks that this is his moment. And I think even when they were planning the Venezuela operation, they always had Cuba in the back of their minds. Those two always came in tandem. And let's see how that pans out.
Yeah, it's worth saying that this is a kind of lifetime ambition for Marco Rubio, as you say, Cuban-American, although his parents did come a couple of years before the revolution.
They weren't Castro fans, though. They did not like Castro.
They did not like Castro, and he has always framed himself as the son of exiles, even when it emerged actually from reporting that they'd come before the revolution. He said still they saw their identity as being part of the exile community. And he's actually written about it in the book he published in 2012 about his life. He's talked about sitting at the feet of his grandfather. And there was one bit in it where he actually said, I used to boast that one day I would lead an army of exiles back and become president of a free Cuba, which is quite prophetic in a way in terms of what he's now doing and what is now his ambition in terms of Cuba and regime change in Cuba. He didn't write about Venezuela at the time, but later it became a really big push for him as well. And I actually remember seeing him in Congress after the Venezuela operation had happened, after he'd been briefing representatives in Congress about Venezuela, and very clear, as you say, from that time that Cuba for him is the ultimate aim. And it is just worth saying that today reporting started from Axios, who are very good at getting the inside track on all of this, have said that he's having secret talks, not so secret now because the State Department have confirmed them, but secret talks with Raul Castro's grandson, who is seen as the apple of his grandfather's eye, Raulito.
Little
Raulito,
Raul, yes.
Little Raul, they call him, used to work as a security guard for Raul Castro and, now a very important figure, but really important, isn't it? Because what it means is that Marco Rubio is not talking to the official government at the moment. He's talking a bit like they did in Venezuela to the people who they see as the power brokers. And some people are arguing that in the same way as they left the vice president in charge, Delcy Rodriguez, in Venezuela, that they are looking for a Delcy in Cuba. Do you think that's the way it's more likely to go rather than an operation like we've seen in Venezuela?
I don't think there's an obvious Delcy in Cuba. That's certainly what I'm being told by people who know the place better than I do at the moment. There's no obvious place. There's no obvious Delcy to take over from the president should he be removed. Also, you're dealing with a country that is much more unified in its opposition to America. I mean, even if they hate the regime, they don't, Cuba's had been steeped in nationalism and patriotism and anti-Americanism from the very beginning, which is not the case with Venezuela. And in a sense, the idea of where it belongs in that hemisphere, the idea of its opposition to, this great big giant next door, is much more part of the Cuban DNA than anything else. Because first of all, they don't have any natural resources. There's really very little oil or anything like that in Cuba. The resources they had were their military expertise. And remember that 32 Cuban bodyguards around Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan president, were killed during that extraction. Their other expertise and their other big export were Cuban doctors. They have an excellent health system. And they used to basically send doctors in return for Venezuelan oil. Well, that's gone as well. That's the end of that income. But also in terms of the status of the island, its own self-esteem. We may be small, we may be in the shadow of Uncle Sam, but we have military prowess. We have a fantastic health service, and we're highly educated. All that's beginning to disappear and is endangered by this embargo. So there's not that much left, and I think that makes it much. I mean, the nightmare I think for the administration, which is certainly what I've heard from people close to it, is that if you allow Cuba to collapse, which is a real possibility, you're going to end up with a massive flood of Cuban refugees, migrants heading across the straits to Key West, which is literally 6 hours away by boat, or to Miami itself, which is a little bit further. And that would be, counterproductive, to say the least, for Donald Trump, who's trying to do the opposite with migrants, who's hoping that many of the Cubans living in Florida might eventually go back to Cuba. So, I think they're very cautious about what they do, but I think Marco Rubio especially is driving this effort to bleed the regime dry with a combination of, an oil embargo and some gunship diplomacy, and also frightening people in the region not to do business with Cuba. And it leaves Cuba, this slither of land in the Caribbean Sea, completely isolated in a way that actually very few countries probably have been as a result of the actions that America is taking. Well, let's hear from the man himself, Donald Trump. He was asked about Cuba on Air Force One.
Cuba is right now a failed nation, and they don't even have jet fuel to get for airplanes to take off. They're clogging up their runway. We're talking to Cuba right now. I have Marco Rubio talking to Cuba right now, and they should absolutely make a deal because it's really a humanitarian threat. And we have a lot of great Cuban Americans, and they're going to be very happy when they're going to be able to go back and say hello to their relatives and do things that they should have been allowed to do for a long time. I'm very interested in the people that are here that were treated so badly by Castro and the Cuban authorities. They have been treated horribly. So we'll see how it all turns out. But Cuba and us, we are talking. In the meantime, there's an embargo. There's no oil, there's no money, there's no anything.
If a deal isn't made, would you consider an operation like the one in Venezuela?
I don't want to answer that. Why would I answer that? If I was, it wouldn't be a very tough operation, as you can figure. But I don't think that'll be necessary.
What I do find fascinating about the Donald Trump, Marco Rubio relationship over this kind of picks up on what you were saying. When it came to Venezuela, it was almost as if Marco Rubio came up with an America first argument that he could persuade the president to go along with. The idea that we're going to stop the drug cartels from coming into the US, that we're going to save American lives, that we are going to limit immigration rather than, as you say, potentially increase it as a result of that. And perhaps most of all for Donald Trump, that we are going to have access to billions and billions of dollars of Venezuelan oil. And listen to what Donald Trump said in the aftermath of the Maduro operation. all he talked about was oil. I think, I can't tell you for sure, Matt, that this is still the case now, but a couple of weeks after I checked, he had not used the word democracy once. And yet I remember asking directly Rubio about this when we saw him in Congress. You haven't got regime change. And it was very clear that although he was frustrated about that for him, it is all about regime change. But as you say, there is a harder argument to make on Cuba, both because it might actually lead to an increase in immigration, and secondly, because it hasn't got any natural resources. You can hear from that answer on Air Force One, there isn't a kind of push towards the idea of any military intervention. What do you think? What do you think would persuade Donald Trump when it comes to Cuba? What are his motivations on this?
I think there's a bigger point here about Donald Trump's confusion when it comes to what he actually wants. And this is a confusion, judging from his actions, maybe a confusion taking place in his own mind. Because if you look at the application of the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, as announced by him, it's very varied. Some people are flooded with money, like Milei in Argentina. Other people are threatened and they're not threatened, like the Colombians. Venezuela, you've got president extraction, but no regime change. Cuba could be a combination of things. It could be, a threat, do as you're told, be nicer to your own people. Maybe that's like clause 3. But also we want access. I can imagine with Cuba, because it's very beautiful and it used to be the playground of Florida before the revolution. I can imagine Trump saying, my vision for Cuba is what I kind of wanted in Gaza, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, which is a Riviera, lots of Trump hotels, a Trump race course. That is completely possible. I haven't heard this discussed in public. It would not surprise me one bit, especially when Trump is reminded that that is what Cuba used to be for wealthy Americans. Famously, Frank Sinatra went there. A guy called Al Capone used to hang out there. He was on a special air miles deal to Cuba. All these things could be revisited. But the other thing that I think we should really not be too cynical about is that if Donald Trump manages to do something that has eluded every president since J.F. Kennedy, remember, he tried to invade Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, disaster. Jimmy Carter was the opposite. It was the Cubans who sent 125,000 Cuban migrants, including many prisoners from the prisons and, people from psychiatric wards, to America. Fidel Castro opened the gates as a escape valve of discontent, or indeed Obama trying to kill them with kindness, or Trump trying to kill them with sticks rather than carrots. If Donald Trump in his second administration manages to bring down the Cuban regime without a single American soldier setting foot on the island and without a mass exodus of people, and these are all massive ifs, but if he were to do that, it would be an astonishing achievement. And even those Americans who don't much care about Cuba, and the majority probably don't, but even those would think, okay, good on you, mate. This is something that has eluded everyone else, including those people. Do you remember all that stuff about, Fidel Castro's cigars being poisoned and exploding in his face? America has tried to get rid of Cuba unsuccessfully for a very, very long time. And this, you could argue, because of the embargo, because of Venezuela, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore and Russia is not exactly filling that void. Cuba is on its own the way that it has never been on its own. And if there's any chance to bring this government down, this is the moment. And I think that's the calculation in the White House.
Although there will be concerns about what would come afterwards. Unlike in Venezuela, there isn't an opposition there to look to in the same way. And also, there is a lot of vitriol between some of the Cuban Americans in Florida, or the more hardline Cuban Americans in Florida, and the more hardline, Cubans in Cuba close to the administration. For example, the talks or discussions, as the State Department have called them, between Marco Rubio and the grandson of Raul Castro. Some of the speculation around that has suggested that Raul Castro would actually be able to, be exiled from the country and live somewhere safely. Well, that's not going to please Republicans in Florida. Very recently, 4 Republican representatives actually said that they want the government to indict Raul Castro over the incident in 1996 where a humanitarian flight to try and help Cubans in the sea was shot down by Cuba. So there is a lot of ire, isn't there, on either side of this? And, at the moment, it feels like a very, very tense situation.
It does. It's tense, and the Cuban community is bitterly divided between those on the island and those in southern Florida. But at the end of the day, if you're an American president in the White House and you know the importance of the Cuban community in Florida and you know the importance of Florida in any electoral map, that is a prize worth gunning for, even if you don't, unlike Marco Rubio, have very strong personal ties to Cuba itself. But again, I mean, I think if you're anti-regime, the stars are aligning for you. The big question is what actually happens on the ground in the next few weeks and what actually happens in the aftermath. And there's really no one better to talk to about all this than our guest on the program, Jon Lee Anderson, veteran writer for The New Yorker, who's been to Cuba many times and crucially was there 5 months ago and just came back a couple of weeks ago. So he can really give us some sort of comparison of then and now. Jon Lee Anderson, it's good to have you in the studio. You've been to Cuba twice in the last 6 months, I gather, and of course many, many, many times before that. But what have you noticed is the big change on the ground?
The biggest change since January 3rd, when the United States abducted Venezuela's President Maduro and took him as a prisoner to the United States, and then put Cuba on call, is, I think, that awareness by the Cubans that this happened. Why is this important? Venezuela has been supplying Cuba with the majority of its energy needs for the past 20 years. Venezuela was its closest ally in the hemisphere, and precipitously, they are, one, without their usual inadequate energy resources to keep the island running. And they're on call that the Trump administration wants them to change their regime. And so
to the point of suicide?
To the point of suicide by whom?
Yeah.
Well, no, this is just it. I think what we're witnessing at the moment, or rather not witnessing because it's taking place in shadowy hallways behind closed doors, are the beginnings of a dialogue between the Trump regime and the Cuban regime, in which the United States under Trump would like to see the Cubans, change themselves out of existence. I think the initial tranche of concessions that the U.S. expects is an economic opening. In return, very possibly, for U.S.-provided oil supplies. And the idea being, which we're already seeing a variation of this in Venezuela, aren't we? A kind of new relationship between adversarial powers in which the U.S. becomes the lifeline. And the adversaries must sing, must dance to their tune. And so it's a little bit early to call, but that's what I'm sensing is happening. I not only spent some time in Cuba trying to talk to people I know there in business, people connected to the regime, also diplomats, but also in Miami and Washington, as close as I could come to the White House. And the sense I have is that they're aware that this is an historic and momentous moment. I don't think an opportunity for the U.S. to see real change in Cuba. And the Cubans don't really have anywhere to go. And I think, so going back to what you asked me about Cuba, what was the biggest change? There was that, and also just everything had ground to a halt. The blackouts, which were there when I was there 6-8 months ago, had extended now to 12 to 20 hours a day, even in the capital. There was that much less vehicular traffic on the roads.
Empty shelves in the supermarkets.
Yeah. Although there are a number of approved, a handful of entrepreneurs who have been importing goods, food, medicine, and other goods via a series of arcane concessions, many of them from the United States, for some years. And in fact, most of the goods on the island are in fact now imported from the United States. And there are about, I was quite surprised to learn this, but about 40% of Cubans receive remittances, that is to say cash disbursements, from relatives in the United States. So if you combine those facts with the coming fact that this oil crisis, this energy crisis, which is affecting every walk of life, may be resolved by U.S. handouts of oil, or at least allowances of oil, you'll see that the island now depends increasingly on none other than the United States.
Which is rather ironic, isn't it? Before we carry on with the here and now, just let's zoom out a little bit and tell us about this extraordinary fact that, Cuba, this slither of an island in the Caribbean, just south of the Florida Keys, has been literally this geographical thorn in America's side ever since the revolution of 1959.
That's right.
A clash of ideologies, a clash of geopolitics, and Cuba quite deftly managing to get different godfathers along the way. But tell us about the importance of Cuba in the American psyche.
Yes. Well, very well put, Matt. This 770-mile long island, one of the largest, if not the largest island in the Western Hemisphere after Greenland, I think. So
that's a fact.
A
Wow.
massive...
long and thin, though, right?
Long and thin, stretching from just below Florida to nearly to Haiti, with 11 million people. There it is. It was the ultimate thorn in the American side during the whole Cold War. In fact, it galvanized. It became the most acute moment of the Cold War with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, and I think for a lot of Americans, especially those of a certain age, it's the Kennedy era wrapped up with this extraordinary history. The moment at which the U.S. and its ancient enemy, the USSR, the Soviet Union, came closest to a nuclear war, was over Cuba. The Americans attempted to invade and failed to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion a few months before that. And over the decades following that, the Kennedy era, Cuba became the darling and kept darling, the kept darling of the Soviet regime.
With this very charismatic leader in the tall and gravel-voiced Fidel Castro with his cigars, who gave these very long speeches where he railed against Uncle Sam like no one else.
That's right, unlike no one else, and also stimulated and inspired a generation and a half of wannabe revolutionaries like himself, like the Cubans, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And until the end of the 80s, directly trained, financed, and armed many of these guerrilla efforts, which put the U.S. Into, a cold sweat from Guatemala on down to Argentina. So there was nobody quite like Fidel Castro. Yes, he was a dictator. Was he as bad as Saddam Hussein? I would argue no. On the spectrum from light to dark of tyrants, Fidel could be very mean-spirited to his enemies and lock them up for a long time. But he was not, he didn't kill the firstborn of an entire tribe sort of thing. Nonetheless, Fidel bedeviled the United States. The U.S., after its initial attempts, paramilitary attempts to overthrow him, adopted a containment theory whereby something like Trump is initiating now, in a sense, is trying to turn all of the surrounding countries against Cuba. For a long time, right up until the 1980s, if you wanted to fly, let's say, from Mexico, which is very nearby, or Panama, to Cuba, you had to go to Prague first. You had to fly to Czechoslovakia. You had to go to the...
Great for air miles.
Yeah, you had to. Yeah. They didn't have air miles, unfortunately, in those days. And then you had to crisscross the Atlantic again to get there. It was truly contained. One of the very few countries that provided an ongoing lifeline for Cuba was, in fact, Mexico. Mexico, which has its own unique relationship with the United States, and successive regimes of which have always wanted to provide something of a thorn in Uncle Sam's side as well. Never to the degree of Fidel Castro, but enough to give Fidel Castro a lifeline. And so diplomats could come and go from Mexico. There was intelligence operations that came and went. There was a little bit of backdoor as well through Panama as a kind of Phoenician hub of smuggling route and so on. But pretty much from all of the other countries, you couldn't go to Cuba. And if you had been in Cuba, you'd be in trouble back home. That began to change under Jimmy Carter, who opened things up in the wake of Watergate and Vietnam. And in the years since then, in the decades since the Carter days, there have been, many of the countries have reinitiated diplomatic relations with Cuba. Some of them are tetchy and suspicious. Others are, more fulsome. The Cubans, in the waning years of the Cold War, Castro abandoned the use of arms to change, the nature of the regimes in the regime. He forswore guerrilla warfare. Some relationships endured, and instead concentrated on finding a new partners to keep Cuba alive. Cuba back in the 50s, it exported sugar. There was even a sugar billionaire in those days. Sugar had real value. Then came the Soviet Union, effectively replacing sugar. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was several years of real penury where Fidel was looking for someone to replace the Soviet Union. And along came Hugo Chavez.
Right, Venezuela, yeah.
Oil-rich Venezuela. And so they embarked on a 20-year-odd relationship whereby Cuba exported doctors, sports teachers, intelligence agents,
and cigars,
so on, and cigars, in return for oil.
Yeah.
And Chavez happily provided essentially free oil to Cuba, as did his successor Maduro. They used some of it to keep things going in Cuba, and they also resold some of it on the international spot market in order to have hard currency to buy things they needed. And that's all come crashing down now.
I interviewed Chavez once when he was in Havana for a non-aligned summit. I called it the class reunion of the axis of evil. I mean, the Iranians were there, and the Cubans were hosting, and the Venezuelans were there, and all these people that the Bush administration at the time didn't like at all. And Fidel was already ill. He was beginning to die. And of course, Hugo Chavez himself might have been ill at the time because he also died of cancer a few years later. But I asked him about Fidel, and he said, Fidel is the air, he is the water, he is the earth. And I kind of thought, okay, first of all, you're really good at these sound bites. But also, he probably thought of himself as Fidel's equal in terms of rhetoric. I mean, his speeches were arguably even longer. They might not have been better, but he was another thorn in America's side, railing against American imperialism. And that was an extraordinary thing to witness, actually. So even though they lost the Soviet Union, they gained this soulmate who spoke the same language, under the same sun, with the same drinks and the same cigars.
Exactly. In the beginning, Chavez, who won office eventually and became the country's president in 1999, at the time, I remember interviewing him around 2001. He was still talking about, believe it or not, Tony Blair's third way.
Yeah.
He wasn't convinced. By 2005, he had decided he was a socialist.
Yeah.
And he credited with essentially Father Fidel, whom, as you rightly recall, he called him El Farol, meaning the lighthouse, which he was to the left, the revolutionary left in Latin America. And Fidel treated, and I think regarded, Hugo Chavez, the younger man, as something like the prodigal son, who finally had come and would carry on the struggle. And from about 2000 to 2006, when Fidel started to get ill and ultimately had to step down in 2008, handing over to his brother Raul, they were like Mutt and Jeff. The two of them, they even sang songs together. They just loved one another. It was, and Chavez became ever more radical, and became a really conscious thorn in the side of, especially Bush, who he railed against, and called for a multipolar world. Chavez, he was often ridiculed because he was so bombastic and he could be a buffoon. But he was the first leader, as I recall, to come up with this concept of a multipolar world, which sounds alien to Anglo-Saxon ears. But it meant that, to end with the U.S. hegemony by inheriting the world's power after the implosion of the Soviet Union. And, Chavez tried to do things that Fidel had done, like nationalize the oil fields or renationalize them, seizing el latifundio, the big oligarchic private ranches. But they never had the wherewithal in Venezuela, even with Cuba's help, to sort of make a go of it, to really monetize their oil-funded revolution. He gave away a lot of money. I think it was $1 trillion went through Chavez's hands. He was not personally corrupt. Plenty of people around him were. But he gave a lot away.
Yeah.
And that so-called pink tide, you remember that? That period of early 2000s, the first decade when you had a lot of other left-wing leaders in power in Latin America. A lot of them were subsidized by Chavez.
So let's move to today. One of the I can see why Marco Rubio, we discussed this earlier with Anushka, I can see why Marco Rubio wants to get rid of the Cuban regime. He's of Cuban extraction. His parents were very anti-Fidel Castro. He grew up in that South Florida world of Cuban exiles. I can totally see that. What I don't see, and maybe you can help me out here, is what he sees the future of Cuba looking like. And does Trump, although he hasn't said this, but I imagine this inside his head, does Trump imagine that Cuba would return to what it was in the 50s or 40s, sugar barons, Trump hotels? They didn't have them then, but maybe now. The Corniche in Havana, which is there's a lot of beautiful architecture there that is crying out for Trump gold. Is that the vision? Is that their vision? A playground off the coast of Florida?
Well, we saw what his vision for Gaza was.
Yeah.
So imagine what it is for Cuba. I don't think we have to go too far to imagine.
But he hasn't said it yet, which is interesting.
No, he hasn't. He hasn't said it yet. And I think they've been careful. They're aware that however successful so far they've been in Venezuela to merely remove Maduro and get his colleagues to work for them, they're aware that Cuba, it's a different.
And why is it different?
Because, look, the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela was never really a revolution. It was a revolution in Chavez's mind for the time he was alive. It's 25 years old. The Cuban Revolution is 67 years old. You have a massive military that's tried and tested, that is also something of an economic juggernaut. It owns a lot of businesses on the island, everything from fisheries to construction. It's in the military's hands via a series of front companies. It is a very orderly society. They've controlled things for nearly 7 decades. It's an island, physically an island, that makes a big difference. It's one of the reasons why the revolution has been able to last as long as it has. I think if it had, we've seen 2 million of the 11 million people flee in the past 4 years.
Which is an astonishing number,
It's a huge number.
I mean, that's
and one can feel it in Cuba. The lack, especially young and skilled people have left because they didn't feel there was a future for them. But if it had land borders with the United States, how many Cubans would be there now? I think maybe less than half. We saw a third of the Venezuelans leave over the past 10 years. So I think those are the differences. The differences also are that you have a nationalism that's baked hard into the Cuban soul. And it goes back to the 19th century. They were the last of Spain's colonies. Because of a flukish little summer war with the United States in 1895, Cuba fell not away from Spain and into Uncle Sam's hands. And the kind of ardent nationalism with which they'd been fighting against the Spaniards for the previous 30 years, that continued and sort of bled into the generation that gave us Fidel Castro. Right. Mid-20th century, after the World War II.
So even if people don't like the regime necessarily, or in fact even hate it, there is a much stronger sense of Cuban nationalism as defined as anti-Americanism.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there are the Cubans who live in Miami and now almost 3 generations in. I'm sure there are Cuban annexationists. I don't think it's probably as much
Canada.
as half.
Why do you make Cuba the 51st state?
Right. Believe me, going back to the 19th century, this was a real thing. It was openly discussed in the American and the Cuban parliaments. And so this is there. I think for an older generation of Cubans, it's difficult to simply accept that everything they gave their lives to was a failure. And yet, practically speaking, they can look around and know that that's the case. But yet, they cling to ideas that they're proud. They're proud of the things they have achieved, which are deteriorating. The healthcare system,
They were
the
exporting
education
doctors
system.
to Venezuela in return for oil.
And it goes back into scientific breakthroughs, other things that they know that they achieved. I think, look, I'm not an oracle. I can't call it, but I think that What I believe is that reading between the lines when we hear Rubio speak, when we hear Trump speak, there's a sense that they must deal with it somewhat differently.
Right.
And they have. Rubio has said, of course I would like to see regime change in Cuba. And I think most Cubans would. It's very measured.
Yeah.
And the other day on the side of Munich, on the sidelines of Munich, he said, it would be great if they had an economic opening.
Yeah.
So he's giving them lifelines here. This is the way to go.
Is that because it's too precious and they're too aware of the downsides of chaos? It falls apart.
The downsides of chaos.
You're suddenly get another 2 million Cubans washing up, this time in Florida.
Exactly. I think, and this is what I heard around Washington last week as well. You may have as well, which is that they don't want to strangle the patient. Here, Cuba is sort of the patient on a respirator in the ICU, right? And they're squeezing the oxygen with their fingers, but they don't want to cut it off entirely, because then they know they would have chaos. And they are actually only 90 miles from Key West, and they have been rafters, exoduses, and in the past. It could happen again. And there could also be violence within Cuba.
Yeah.
Cubans are factionalized. It's under the surface at the moment. There are plenty of people who are very resentful for the lives they've lived. There's others whose lives are invested in preserving what's left. And you could easily, if you overly orchestrate or overly asphyxiate the island, you could cause civil convulsions.
Is there a Delcy Rodriguez figure? She's the vice president of Venezuela, who's running the country effectively at the moment, who it appears was doing deals or talking to the Trump administration in the run-up to her boss's abduction.
That's right.
Is there such a figure in Cuba?
Well, we've just heard today that the Trump administration has been talking to Raul Castro's grandson, Raulito, who also called El Cangrejo, the crab. Apparently has to do with the deformed finger. He's very close to his grandfather. There's a sense, which I'm not surprised by, frankly. His grandfather, who's 94, Raul, although he stepped down from power, is still the power that be, and everybody knows that what he says will go. So if they open, it will be because Raulito tells Raul, Grandpa, look, I think we should do this, Grandpa. And Grandpa says, not sure. Maybe let's do this, let's do that. There's not a Delcy as such. There was a couple of figures mentioned, one of whom is a grand nephew of Raul, a minister for
in the family.
Yes, minister for external trade, who was recently made a member of the party, which would therefore make him presidential if they want to push him in that direction. It has to be said that one of the virtues of Raul Castro when he succeeded his brother was he instituted a 2-term presidency. After his brother was in power for 49 years and he ran the security services, he instituted a 2-term president, which he respected and stepped down after 10. Diaz-Canel, his handpicked successor, this rather gray 60-something party guy, is in the halfway through his second term now. He has to step down in 2 years. So we could be looking at a kind of transitional period now. If Rubio and Trump feel that this is the way to go, there are more extremist views in Miami, including several American congressmen, Cuban-American extraction, who want to see them asphyxiate the regime.
Sure.
And I had a conversation with one not that long ago, and he basically said, yeah, it's true. It would cause difficulties if you cut off all the flights and all the remittances. But it's like cancer. You have to give chemo to the patient to save the patient. It causes some pain, but in the end, you save the life.
Wow. Not surprising to hear that in Miami from some people. Finally then, and briefly, what would you say you're not an oracle, but I'm going to use you as such at the moment. So you're stuck in my studio, so you have no choice. So in 6 months from now, what does Cuba look like?
If I had to roll the dice.
Roll them.
Okay, Matt, I would say that there's been an economic opening of sorts. The entrepreneurs that I spoke about earlier who are already importing goods, some of them get canceled, others get put forward. They begin to import oil.
From the US.
From the US, which both empowers them and the idea
Sure.
of private enterprise vis-a-vis the state, and also helps resolve the state's problems with providing energy to its people. There's at least that, and then ongoing, maybe fitful talks about the idea of a political transition.
Wouldn't that be ironic if the lifeline to Cuba at the end of the day, after the Soviet Union and Russia and bits of China and Venezuela ended up being its big enemy, the US, and they still managed to carry on sort of on their own terms?
It would be extraordinary.
And not impossible.
Not impossible. Not impossible.
Jon Lee Anderson, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Jon Lee Anderson from The New Yorker is speaking to me there. Now, we always ask you to bring your thoughts and your comments to our inbox about our wonderful podcast. And there have been plenty, haven't there?
Yeah, last week we were talking about the horrific crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, and I had the opportunity to sit down with two survivors, Lisa Phillips and Lara Bloom McGee, who were incredibly brave and powerful, and I was just so grateful for them speaking up. And it turns out that hundreds of people watching it felt the same way and wrote in to talk about how brave they were. And there were also plenty of people criticising the US Attorney General, Pam Bondi. Thank you so much for all your comments on that. We really do appreciate it.
Keep them coming. And thanks for listening. That's it from this edition of TrumpWorld. I'm Matt Frei in London.
And I'm Anushka Asthana in Washington, DC.
Bye-bye.